The morning sun hit the weathered cedar fence, warming the wood until it smelled of sap and age. High above the village of Oakhaven, the golden cat sat perfectly still. He watched the light spill across the valley floor, turning the dew into scattered diamonds. Below, the village was waking up. A chimney puffed a thin line of gray smoke. A door creaked open. The sounds of a waking world rose up to meet him, but he did not look down. His focus remained locked on the jagged line of the horizon, miles away, where the hills met the sky in a sharp, unforgiving edge. A sudden breeze swept across the fence, carrying a scent that did not belong to the fields. It was sharp, metallic, and cold. He stood up, his paws gripping the cedar, and leaned into the wind. The familiar comfort of the fence suddenly felt like a cage. He simply waited, his eyes tracing the path that led away from everything he had ever known. The silence was heavy with a decision. Milo trotted up, his paws kicking up dust that caught the morning light. He stopped at the base of the fence and looked up. "Still staring at the clouds, Yellow?" he barked. The golden cat hopped down, his tail twitching against the wood. "I am thinking about the city," he replied. From the shadows of the barn, Luna emerged, her ears flicking with irritation. "The city is a forest of steel and noise," she warned, her gaze sharp. Pip the sparrow fluttered down, landing on a fence post. "It is a place where millions of stories collide," the bird countered. Yellow looked at his friends, seeing the doubt in Luna and the curiosity in Pip. The decision hung in the air, heavy and electric. Milo sighed, his ears dropping. Then he wagged his tail in a sudden, sharp motion. "Fine, but we pack light." The tension broke. They stood in a circle, the village behind them already feeling like a memory. Yellow looked at each of them, his resolve hardening. "Let us find those stories," he said. They moved as one, stepping into the unknown. At the edge of the main road, a wooden cart sat waiting, its bed piled high with crates. The farmer was nowhere to be seen. Yellow signaled, and the group scrambled up, finding space between the wooden slats. The cart groaned as it lurched forward, the heavy wheels catching on the gravel. The vibration traveled straight through their paws. Every rotation of the iron-rimmed wheels ground against the earth. The village of Oakhaven began to shrink, turning into a cluster of dots against the green hills. Milo pressed his back against a crate. Luna crouched low, watching the trees blur into a smear of brown and green. Pip tucked his head under a wing, riding the sway. The road stretched out, a long, dusty ribbon pulling them toward an unknown destination. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows. Hours passed in a haze of motion and noise. The familiar scent of damp soil and blooming clover faded, replaced by the dry, metallic tang. The horizon began to shift, the soft curves of the hills flattening out, replaced by a distant, jagged silhouette that loomed larger. There was no turning back now. The cart slowed to a halt, the grinding of the wheels finally dying into a metallic click. The silence that followed was short-lived. Before the group could even stretch their cramped limbs, a low, constant hum vibrated through the pavement. It was the sound of 1,000 engines. Sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the heavy atmosphere like jagged glass. Yellow hopped down, his paws hitting the hard, unforgiving concrete. He inhaled, expecting the familiar sweetness of pine or damp earth, but his lungs were met with a sharp, stinging tang of exhaust and scorched rubber. Milo jumped down beside him, his ears twitching at the chaotic symphony of honking horns and screeching metal. Luna emerged from the shadows of the crates, her nose wrinkling in immediate distaste. Pip took flight, circling once before landing on a rusted street sign. Every direction they looked offered a new, harsh sensation. The ground beneath them felt unnatural, rigid, and cold. They stood at the threshold of the metropolis, a wall of noise and fumes rising up to meet them. The transition was complete. They moved deeper into the canyon of glass and steel. The buildings rose like cliffs, blocking the sun and casting long, jagged shadows across the sidewalk. Without warning, a massive bus surged forward from the intersection, its air brakes releasing a high-pitched, piercing hiss that echoed off the brick walls. Yellow froze. His muscles locked, His tail puffed to twice its size, and he pressed his belly against the cold concrete, unable to take another step. The sheer force of the wind from the passing vehicle ruffled his fur, carrying the grit of the street into his eyes. Milo barked, a sharp sound that barely registered above the mechanical roar, and nudged Yellow toward the safety of an alleyway. They scrambled into the narrow gap between two towering structures, hoping for a reprieve from the traffic. Instead, they found a wall of damp, stained brick. Luna paced the small space, her claws clicking frantically against the ground. She looked up at the sliver of sky, now obscured by tangled wires and dark vents. Every shadow looked like a trap, and every distant siren sounded like a closing door. They were trapped in a maze of steel, with no path forward. The panic in the alley deepened until a heavy, rhythmic thudding approached the entrance. A wooden cart rolled into view, its wheels groaning under the weight of metal pans. The group pressed back against the cold brick, eyes wide, watching the figure behind the cart. It was a man, his apron dusted with white flour, his face etched with lines of long labor. He stopped, his gaze dropping to the four travelers huddled in the shadows. He did not shout, he did not chase. Instead, he reached down to a shelf beneath his cart and pulled out a shallow metal bowl. He filled it from a canteen, the water splashing clearly against the rim, and set it carefully on the pavement. The man knelt, his movements slow and deliberate, and pointed a calloused, flour-stained finger toward the end of the alley. He traced a line in the air, gesturing toward a distant patch of green visible through the urban grid. "Follow the green," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the city's static. The tension in the group snapped. Luna stopped pacing, her ears tilting toward the man's steady hand. Milo stepped forward, sniffing the water, his tail giving a single, tentative wag. The man stood, wiped his hands on his apron, and pushed his cart onward into the noise. He had left them more than water. He had left them a path. Yellow looked at his companions, the fear in his chest replaced by a sharp, focused resolve. As they reached the park perimeter, the sun vanished behind the skyline. The transition was instant. Streetlights flickered to life in a rhythmic wave, turning the sky into a deep velvet purple. The city transformed from a gray monolith into a glowing grid of neon. They paused at a massive intersection where traffic surged like a river of steel. A high-pitched mew cut through the mechanical drone. A small kitten stood paralyzed in the center of the crosswalk. Yellow did not hesitate. He darted into the flow of traffic, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached the kitten, nudged it firmly with his shoulder, and guided it toward the curb just as the vehicle roared past. They scrambled onto the sidewalk, the kitten trembling against his side. Yellow stayed until the kitten found a sheltered corner, then rejoined his friends. The world was indeed a forest of steel, but they were no longer just passing through it. They were part of its rhythm. They found a service ladder leading to the roof, a climb that left their muscles aching and their breath ragged. Above the constant hum of the city, the air was colder, smelling of ozone and distant rain. They huddled together behind a ventilation unit, a small island of fur against the sprawling, glowing grid below. The neon signs pulsed in rhythmic waves of red and blue, casting harsh light that washed out the stars. Luna shifted, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "The grass was quiet," she whispered, the sound barely audible over the wind. "Here, the silence never comes." Milo let out a long, ragged breath. Yellow watched them, his own heart heavy with the memory of the cedar fence. "Home is not the grass," he said, his voice steady and clear. "It is the company you keep." Milo lifted his head, his tail giving a slow, deliberate thump against the roof. They were anchored by the bond they held. Yellow stepped to the very edge of the rooftop, his paws gripping the cold gravel. Below, the city stretched toward the horizon, a sprawling map of light and shadow that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Milo moved up beside him, his shoulder brushing against Yellow's side. They did not speak, but the rhythm of their breathing matched, a steady cadence that cut through the distant, low-frequency roar of the metropolis. A siren wailed somewhere far off, a sharp, piercing sound that climbed through the air, yet neither of them flinched. The city was no longer a chaotic maze. It was a landscape of possibility. Yellow looked at the endless grid, his gaze tracing the lines of light that bled into the dark. He turned to Milo, who was watching the horizon with a calm, focused intensity. The dog's tail gave a slow, rhythmic sweep against the roof surface. "The world is vast," Yellow said, his voice carrying clearly over the wind, "and we have only just begun to see it." Milo nodded, his eyes reflecting the flickering neon below. "Together?" he asked. Yellow leaned into him, a gesture of absolute resolve. "Always." They stood there for a long time, 4 small silhouettes against the glowing sprawl, watching the city lights shift and change. The uncertainty of the future did not loom. It beckoned. They were no longer travelers lost in a strange land, but explorers standing at the threshold. With a final look at the horizon, they turned away from the edge, moving as one toward the stairwell. The path ahead was long, but they moved with confidence.